Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and coming up on today's program, rescuers say that Israeli strikes in the Gaza Strip have resulted in the deaths of at least 52 people, 33 of them they lost their lives and were in a school-turned-shelter. Well, the Civil Defense Agency said that many of the casualties at that school in Gaza City were in fact children. Well, Israel says the site was housing what they described as key terrorists. Meanwhile, the Spanish foreign minister has called for an arms embargo against Israel at the start of a meeting in Madrid aimed at bringing an end to the war. So lots to talk about, and coming up on today's programme, we'll be speaking to the former top UN official for humanitarian affairs. We'll also be speaking to the former Deputy Prime Minister of Israel. Well, let's get some more analysis and reaction now from Gidi Grinstein, who is a former Israeli peace negotiator under Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He joins us from New York. Thank you so much for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. You served as secretary of the Israeli delegation for the Camp David negotiations. You were also at Camp David a quarter of a century ago. And you recently wrote that the Oslo Accords are going to eventually emerge as being the only solution for the post-war era in Gaza. I mean, that all looks like a very long way off at the moment, but what does that era look like?
Well, first of all, I said that the Oslo Accords adjusted and adapted to the current environment, but basically the Oslo Accords do include a number of key ideas that are very relevant to war-ending deal in Gaza. The first is that they introduced the concept of an interim period of 4 or 5 years, during which there is capacity building on the Palestinian side primarily. And this would be absolutely essential for Gaza in order to clear the debris and the mines, begin the process of reconstruction, establish a self-governing Palestinian entity in Gaza. So this concept is crucial. Second is that the Oslo Accord actually acknowledges that the area of the West Bank is divided into 3 categories of territories: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is fully controlled by the Palestinian side. Area B has security control of Israel, but civilian control by the Palestinians, and Area C is fully controlled by Israel. I believe that this structure is very relevant to the future of Gaza. The area of Gaza will have to be divided, at least for a temporary phase during that interim period that I mentioned earlier, where some area equivalent to Area A in the West Bank will be controlled by the Palestinians and also by the international force that hopefully will be brought in. And the perimeter of Gaza, the security areas of Gaza, will be under a regime that will be similar to Area B in the West Bank. There are many other points, but I'll just mention one that is crucial, and that is the economic system in Gaza. Today, there is no law in Gaza. Gaza is a lawless territory. Once the war ends and there is a desire to reintroduce a legal framework into Gaza, I believe there will be 2 options, either to negotiate a legal framework bottom up or to just import the legal framework that was created by Oslo. And at that point, I believe that it will be much easier to bring in the existing agreements that prevail in the West Bank into Gaza than to create a whole new legal and economic system. So for these reasons and others, I believe that at some point the Oslo Accords will become a very important reference point for the day after, the arrangements of the day after in Gaza.
Yeah, but when we listen to the latest statements given by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the latest I've seen is that, the end game, as far as he sees it, is full control of Gaza. I mean, there's a mismatch, isn't there, between what he thinks an end game might look like and what Oslo would dictate?
Yes, of course. If he speaks about full control of Gaza, then that will be basically the military will be deployed all over Gaza, and Israel will have to assume full control, civilian and military control for Gaza. This will be a huge burden economically, diplomatically, in terms of Israel's international standing, and also on the civilian system in Israel. So the military side, the diplomatic side, the civilian side, it's going to cost a lot of money. So I don't think that this is actually sustainable. And therefore, even if Israel establishes full control of the Gaza territory and the Gaza population, that will only be an interim phase, after which there will be pressure to renegotiate some sort of an agreement between a Palestinian leadership that is legitimate whether it's empowered by the PLO or the PA or some sort of different legitimate Palestinian self-governing body on the one side and the Israeli side. At the end of the day, we have to remember some basic math. There are 7 million Jews in Israel, 2 million non-Jewish minority within Israel. In Gaza, 2 million people. In the West Bank, 3 million Palestinians. The entity that is called the State of Israel cannot, in the long term, control Gaza and also the West Bank and remain a Jewish and a democratic state as it aspires to be.
It's interesting just looking at what's been happening these last 20 months. I mean, I'm just wondering whether you get the impression Israel has a strategy here or whether it's sort of taking each day as it comes. What's your thinking?
Well, if there is a strategy, it's not declared. And to the extent that that strategy exists, this is the strategy of the far-right factions of the government who are able to impose their will on Netanyahu, and their strategy is to eventually take Gaza over, cancel the disengagement of 2005, and settle in Gaza permanently, while controlling the security perimeter of Gaza. I believe, and I think it's also validated in polls, that most Israelis do not support that. Most Israelis would like to see some other arrangement that ensures security, but does not involve direct control of the Palestinians in Gaza. And therefore, I believe that the prime minister is in a position where he's actually unable, for political reasons, to articulate a vision that brings together the day after with the political horizon, the economic side with the political side, with regard to Gaza. And therefore, what we're seeing is that the Israeli government is really pushing for very small deals, hostage exchange for prisoners, if at all, very short ceasefires. But at the end of the day, the current political structure in Israel doesn't have the ability to negotiate a war-ending deal. So that's what you're looking at. You're actually looking at some factions, dominant factions within the government from the far right, that are preventing the national security establishment to crystallize a vision for the day after in Gaza.
Okay, and obviously there's growing pressure. I mean, there's been pressure for some time, but I would say it's grown in recent months, especially from regional powers, for the recognition of a Palestinian state. I mean, do you feel that Prime Minister Netanyahu and those in his inner core are feeling that pressure?
I don't think there was a really tangible pressure on Netanyahu up until recent weeks, when it seems that the Trump administration, of all players, has begun to be impatient with the current positions of the Israeli government. So we saw a visit by President Trump to the region that from an Israeli perspective was stunning. Israel thinks that, or holds itself to be, the closest ally of the United States in the region. And there you have President Trump, who's really perceived to be a great friend of Israel. He's coming to the region without even stopping in Israel, going to Riyadh, going to Doha, going to Abu Dhabi, signing all these massive agreements about top technology, which really chip away on what we call in Israel the qualitative edge of Israel. On top of that, he's meeting the president of Syria, al-Jilani. He's removing the sanctions without even talking to Israel. Before coming to Israel, he signed some sort of a ceasefire deal with the Houthis that allows them to continue to fire at us in Israel. Last week I was in Israel 2 nights. The Houthis are firing and there are sirens. So he talks directly to Hamas. He has negotiations with Iran. I mean, he's taking all these steps that signal to the Israeli side that the train is leaving the station. President Trump is impatient with the current environment and he wants to change it. And if Israel doesn't kind of come along, it will be left with its own problems. We have to remember that the current position of the Israeli government is really pushing the Trump administration into a split, a dramatic split. On one side is Israel with its very harsh stances on the outcome of the war in Gaza, refusing any vision of a Palestinian self-determination, a Palestinian state, even in the long-term future, even if it's a state with limited powers and responsibilities, et cetera, all these ideas are rejected. And then on the other side of the term of the American geopolitical considerations, you have Saudi, you have the UAE, you have Qatar, you have Egypt, you have Jordan, you have an opportunity to stabilize Syria. There is a historic opportunity to get some breakthroughs in Lebanon. So all of these huge opportunities, on one hand, the positions of the Israeli government on the other hand, and this is why you're seeing growing impatience by the Trump administration with the Israeli government.
Okay.
And that is a burn that the Israelis are feeling very acutely.
Right. I mean, so a clear message being sent to Prime Minister Netanyahu by Washington. I mean, how's the message being received, do you think? I mean, are you getting the sense perhaps there's some panic starting to set in?
I think that there is a real deep surprise. I mean, it's beyond think. I'm talking to a lot of people in government, and what I hear is that they thought that they had Trump within their sphere of influence. That Trump is, I don't want to sound too crude, but he's in their pocket. He's under their control. They could manipulate him. But guess what? You know, Trump will not be manipulated by anybody. And that kind of signaling that came from the Israeli side may have even triggered some of the backlash that we're seeing from Washington. Now, of course, I hope that eventually Israel and the United States will be aligned, that Israel will come along, but because there are tremendous opportunities for Israeli national security right now in the region. Normalization with Saudi, you know, opening, stabilizing the situation in Syria, having a permanent border with Lebanon, which is really a tangible goal that the Trump administration can actually push forward. So we're seeing all these opportunities. And I hope that the Israeli government will eventually come along and capture the moment.
I mean, just to sort of wrap up this conversation, I mean, in terms of international support for Israel, I mean, there's been strong condemnation of what's been happening in Gaza coming from a number of European countries, even Germany, you know, perhaps one of Israel's closest European allies, expressing extreme concern about what's happening in Gaza. I mean, how isolated, when we take into account the Trump administration's apparent stance on what's happening in Gaza, how isolated is Israel now looking?
We should be very worried. We're seeing effectively some sort of a collapse of our international standing, and it is like a little bit of a domino effect, because once prominent countries like Britain, France, Germany, Canada, etc., have joined kind of the band of condemnation of Israeli policies in Gaza, this is very worrying. Other countries will do so as well. Even Italy was perceived to be an ally led by a right-wing government that is fundamentally very supportive of Israel, has been very critical of our policies. And this is the point where our government took a big bet. The big bet was that Hamas thrived on the humanitarian aid that was coming into Gaza. Hamas was seizing the aid, keeping some of it in stock for future period of strife, of conflict with Israel, and then selling it and profiteering from the aid that was coming into Gaza. So the government of Israel said, no aid into Gaza. And they were betting that Hamas will collapse, or at least show signals or signs of compromise on a hostage deal before the line of credit of international legitimacy is exhausted. But what happened is that the international legitimacy collapsed before Hamas collapsed. So that was before the positions of Hamas changed. So now the government of Israel actually came up with a new idea, and that is to privatize the distribution of food in Gaza. But I think that this idea, if you're following closely what has been happening in the last 2 days, has been half-cooked. The legal structures were not clear. And that idea, unfortunately and sadly, is collapsing as well, which means that for the Palestinian population, aid, food, all the sustenance that is required in Gaza may be delayed. But for the Israeli side, on our hand, we have a brewing and escalating humanitarian crisis. There's no easy answer here, which actually brings us to the earlier question that you asked me. And that is that because of all of these developments, the most likely scenario is that eventually Israel will have to take direct military and civilian control of the population in Gaza. I think it's a very better, but sadly, I think it's also right now increasingly a likely outcome of the war.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Gidi Grinstein. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Diana Buttu, who is a human rights lawyer, former Palestinian peace negotiator, who joins us from Haifa in Israel. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to start by asking you, obviously it's been an extremely violent 48 hours in Gaza, a very high death toll. And as someone who's lived in Gaza, I just want to ask you what goes through your mind when you look at images of people in Gaza and seeing what they're going through at the moment.
All that I can think about is genocide. And all I can think about is my friends and the places that I lived in when I was in Gaza. From what I know of when I've spoken to my friends today, we've got the vast majority of the population is now confined to about 19 or 20% of the Gaza Strip. That means that people are living on top of one another. It was already the most densely populated place on earth. Add to that the Israelis are bombing this 19 or 20% that remains, and as well, they're starving them. So the combination of them living with complete insecurity, no place is safe, living on top of one another, with no food, no water, no sanitation, and then constantly being bombed, there's no other word for it other than genocide, and I think it's time for the world to acknowledge this.
And we are told that 107 aid trucks did get in on Sunday. I just want to ask you what you're hearing from your contacts on the ground, is any of that reaching people that need it the most? Or is that just a trickle that's addressing perhaps one small section of the Gaza Strip?
It's what the UN calls a teaspoon of aid. And the reason that they're calling it a teaspoon of aid is because, first and foremost, Israel shouldn't be blocking aid to begin with. This isn't Israel's to be blocking. This is aid that is coming in from members of the international community who don't believe in genocide, who do think that Palestinians should have the right to live. And moreover, on a normal day before all of this began, before the genocide began, there was an average of 600 to 700 trucks needed daily to get into the Gaza Strip. Now, that's at a time when people were still able to live off of the land. They were still able to grow. They were still able to plant things. They were still able to fish. They were still able to keep their own cattle, their own livestock. Today, we're talking about a need that is tenfold of what is being allowed in. And not only is it not being allowed in, it's being allowed in as a teaspoon, but it's actually not reaching the places where it needs to go. The only supplies that Israel has allowed in so far is flour, a little bit of baby formula, and some medical supplies. That's not enough to sustain life. And that's exactly what the point is. Israel wants to keep committing genocide. It's made it clear that it intends to starve Gazans. And the only reason that it's allowing this trickle, this teaspoon in, is because of the international condemnation that it's been receiving.
Do you get the impression as someone who lives in Israel that international condemnation that you mentioned, and it is coming from far and wide, it's coming from Europe, it's coming from the Middle East, it's even coming from the United States, and the Trump administration is not looking quite as friendly to Prime Minister Netanyahu as some might have thought a few weeks ago. Is that message getting through?
It is, and yet at the same time, you still have a population that thinks that it's okay to carry out genocide. And so on the one hand, while they are hearing the condemnation and the criticism, they're able to slough it off as just somehow that they have the right to do this. And so this is the problem, is that the words need to be backed by deeds. Yes, we've heard condemnations, but so far the average Israeli is not paying the price. We haven't seen that there has been a cutoff of free trade agreements or of trade agreements in general. We haven't seen that Israelis have been barred from traveling to places. We haven't seen that anything has happened to them. Life for them is normal, and so for them it's very easy to just push it off and just to dismiss any international condemnation. But it's more than that that's happening in Israel. It's also that we see that Israelis themselves have taken to the streets to try to block these aid trucks from entering. And we've seen that there have been Israelis that have gone down to the edge of the Gaza Strip and are holding barbecues in order so that Palestinians who live in Gaza can smell the barbecues that they are making. And so it's a society that has not yet gotten the message that genocide is not acceptable. This is why it's so urgent for the world to be acting.
But you're not talking about all Israelis, are you? You're talking about a certain percentage of the population.
I wish I could say that it was a small percentage of the population, but it's not. A very high percentage of the population still believes in supporting this genocide. Those who are opposed to the war are opposed only because they want to see the return of the Israelis, not out of any love for Palestinians or loathing of genocide. The protests that we've seen have not been anti-genocide protests. There have been protests that are simply calling for the Israeli government to end the war, but not anything beyond that. This is the tragedy, is that the way that this country was created, the way that Israel was created, was through the dehumanization of Palestinians. It's the only way that you could take over somebody else's land, that you could live in somebody else's house. And that dehumanization process has been allowed to fester for 77 years, to the point where you see that Israelis, everyday Israelis, are not really calling for the end to genocide, but instead are simply supporting the war. If there was a huge push to end this genocide, it would have ended long ago. If Israelis were feeling the pain, the international pain, then this would have ended long ago. But unfortunately, the world's not doing anything, and Israelis left to their own devices are simply not going to end it.
So what sort of conversations do you have there in Israel, in your daily life, with the people you encounter? What's the tone of a conversation you would have with an ordinary person in a taxi or on the street in Israel?
That's a great question, Tom. Look, a lot of it centers on them trying to either deny the Nakba or to be an apologist for the Nakba. This is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. And similarly, it's the case when it comes to denying this genocide or being an apologist for this genocide. I simply don't understand how somebody can condone the killing of 16,000 kids and the starvation of 2 million people. And yet this is what it's like to live here on a day-to-day basis. We are to be blamed for our own deaths. We're to be blamed for the ethnic cleansing of our country. We're to be blamed for genocide. And that, of course, is certainly not healthy, which is why this pressure must come from outside, just as it did when it came to Nazi Germany. The way that that ideology ended was through a wholesale program of explaining to people who supported the Nazis that this is not okay, that genocide is not acceptable in this day and age.
In a recent article, you're quoted as saying you're sometimes asked by people in Gaza, and they say, listen, Diana, you live in Israel. What do Israelis say about what they're doing in Gaza? That's what people in Gaza are asking you as someone who lives in Israel. I'm just wondering how you answer that question. How do you respond?
I try not to. And the reason I try not to is because for my friends who are living in Gaza, they're looking for hope. They're looking for a means to stay alive. And if I tell them the honest truth, the truth is actually a very painful one. On a day-to-day basis, I hear Israeli politicians openly calling for starvation, and then, of course, denying that they're starving people. I hear on a day-to-day basis them calling for Gaza to be burned. We just heard a member of the Knesset, the parliament, say this just a few weeks ago and did not get any consternation. There was no condemnation in the Knesset for saying so. On a daily basis, I hear cultural figures, public figures, talking about how Palestinians should be starved, how there are no innocents, how even children are legitimate targets. But of course, this is not the conversation that I want to be having with my friends in Gaza, because I don't want them to feel that the world has abandoned them. They already feel as though the world has abandoned them. So sometimes I do tell them the truth, but it's always a truth that I try to kind of soften, because I don't want people in Gaza to feel the wrath that I live on a day-to-day basis of Israelis who are openly calling for genocide, who are openly saying that it's okay to kill kids. And it's such a devastating place to be living in, and such a devastating mindset that you see people, whether they're young or old, thinking that it's okay to carry out genocide, and that they're legitimate, that it's legitimate to do so.
I mean, you say the world has forgotten them, but I mean, it sounds from where I sit like there is something of a crescendo when it comes to the condemnation of what's happening in Gaza. And it's coming from far and wide. It's coming from Germany. It's coming from many countries in the Arab world. It's coming from the United Kingdom. It's coming from France, most notably from the president himself. Even some would say coming from the Trump administration. I mean, does that how it sounds to you? Does it sound like we've reached a point of condemnation that we have perhaps never got to before?
You know, Tom, we have reached a point of condemnation where we've got, but it's taken, look how long it's taken. It's taken the killing of more than 54,000 Palestinians that we know of.
Right,
These
it's
are
taken 20
deaths,
months.
not the indirect deaths. But, and the flattening of Gaza, there's nothing left. In places like Rafah, there's not even a single house left. 90% of the buildings have been totally decimated. So yes, there's a crescendo in the condemnations, but we haven't yet begun to see any action. And this is the part that is so devastating. We already have three decisions by the International Court of Justice. We already have indictments that have been issued for Netanyahu, for Gallant. I'm not sure why they haven't been issued for Israel Katz, the current defense minister. We have all of these mechanisms that are available to hold Israel to account, and yet nothing has been done. So while, yes, there are statements, the statements alone are not bringing an end to the bombs.
I just want to ask you about one other issue for which you've been in the newspapers in recent days, certainly in the United Kingdom, because you issued a video online. It was shared by the football commentator, ex-England captain Gary Lineker, who stepped down from a BBC show as a consequence. His last show was yesterday, I believe, on Sunday. How do you feel about how all of that played out?
Well, the reason that there was so much attention brought to the video is not because of the video itself. And what was very important is that Lineker did not condemn the video or the content of the video, in which I describe what it's like as a Palestinian to be living under Zionism. And I describe very quickly what Zionism is about. The reason that he ends up stepping down was because somebody had attached an emoji to the video. And so I stand very much by the content of the video. I wasn't the person who added the emoji, and neither was he, obviously. And so the point is that people are trying to somehow dismiss the content of the video in which I talk about what Zionism is about, which is the theft of land, and trying to claim it as their own. But they can't dismiss that. And because they can't dismiss that, because it's truthful, they then go after the emoji that neither I nor Mr. Lineker put on the video itself.
But you do understand the uproar and the anger and the sort of the connotations of that rat emoji. I mean, do you condemn it?
I didn't put the rat emoji on it, and so it
but you condemn the fact that someone did.
Anything to. There's nothing that I have to deal with it. It's very interesting. I'm always asked to condemn the actions of other people rather than the actions of my own. I'm a person who is very clear when it comes to anti-Semitism. I have no place for it in my life. I don't think there's any place for it in the world. And the fact that this emoji ended up being put on it is obviously very unfortunate. But that's the whole point: is that people are trying to detract from the actual message and focus on the emoji rather than focusing on the message itself.
Let's turn our focus back to Gaza specifically and what's happening at this very moment. You've talked about sort of inaction, inaudible voices from world leaders, hollow promises. Specifically, who would you like to be saying and doing what?
I would love for the international community as a community to come forward and be imposing economic sanctions on Israel. I would love for the United States, which provides Israel with 69% of its weaponry, to be stopping that weaponry as is required under both international and U.S. law. I would love for Germany and Italy, the other two countries, and the UK, the other two countries that provide Israel with its weaponry, to also be halting their weapons supply. And I would love to see that Israel be held to account, including Israeli leaders, for everything that they have said and done. You know, Tom, what's been interesting throughout the past 20 months is that Israeli leaders have made it absolutely no secret that they intend to commit genocide. They've made it clear that they want to make the Gaza smaller in size. They've made it clear that they want to make it thinner in population. They've made it clear that they intend to starve Gaza. These are not statements that I'm making up. These are their own statements. And they've been carried out in terms of actions as well. What's shocking to me is that even though the Israelis have made this clear, that the world seems to be somehow incapable of doing what's necessary. And what's necessary is an arms embargo. What's necessary is boycotting Israel. What's necessary is placing sanctions on Israel. And what's necessary is holding these leaders and their soldiers to account for the genocide, as has been the case in other examples of genocide around the world.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, but it's been a real pleasure talking to you. We really appreciate your time. Diana Buttu, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Well, let's get more on the situation now. We can speak to Sir Stephen O'Brien, who was the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian and Emergency Relief at the United Nations. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Can I just start by asking you, sir, for your reaction to what's happened in Gaza during the course of the last 24 hours?
Well, my concern is, of course, for the people who are either killed, but particularly those who are left and who are suffering, and for all the vulnerable people, and indeed for those who are continuing to try to survive, given the inadequacy of the amount of food and life-sustaining materials that are getting into the Gaza Strip, and particularly being required to attend to the south. Even if you happen to be part of the central or the north, you are being required to move south in order to get anything or any chance of anything. It's particularly troubling, and for all of us who are seeing these shots on television, when you see the children so desperate, let alone those scrambling for food, but the absolutely emaciated pictures of children in hospitals, it's, of course, it troubles us all.
It's reported that some, 2 million people, that's basically the entire population of Gaza, is now at risk of famine. Is this the worst it's been so far, would you say, these last 20 months?
Well, I can't be sure about that because I'm not, of course, involved in the actual day-to-day, but it's certainly, in terms of predicting, because there was the blockade and because, therefore, all the supplies ran short, and then there was the desperate need to get the materials in, food, shelter, warmth, medicines, baby kits, formula, all the things that are absolutely necessary to sustain life. There has been a real problem because the way that the UN, under international humanitarian law, both does and is indeed required, anybody providing such things are required to make sure that such aid is unimpeded, unhindered, completely independent, and focused on supplying those who have the greatest vulnerabilities and the most need. So, of course, that means you have to be, to a high degree, you have to be blind as to who those people are, other than, of course, fighters, where that you're not required to supply terrorists, but you are required to supply their families. So it's a very tough business in terms of compliance with the law when you match that against clearly Israel's stated intent, which is to eliminate Hamas. So I can see that the cry that there is a march towards famine is very, very sincere, it's serious, it's based upon evidence, but like all these things, it's much more important that people warn that we're heading that way rather than waiting for the proof of it. And then, of course, we all go into a different gear and we rally and people become even more outraged. But the point is to try and forewarn so that we get the supplies in.
One of the headlines in the last 24 hours or so has been the resignation of Jake Wood, the executive director of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I don't know whether you're aware of that group and its activities, but I just wondered whether you think his resignation is significant, and if so, what it tells us.
Well, I think it's always very difficult from afar to make a judgment on that, other than clearly a very good leader, a very good man who has found himself forced to consider his position and then take a big decision to resign to the very thing that he is most qualified and indeed wished to do. Anybody who's a humanitarian is always wanting to actually act and make it happen. So this must have been a very serious challenge that he just couldn't either have the authority or he wasn't able to make happen what he knows needs to happen in order to make sure that the humanitarian relief is in. I mean, of course, we all understand this is underneath the most phenomenally difficult politics and military action. And we do understand that Israel absolutely does have the right to defend itself against terrorists. And that is what exactly has happened. But it's gone on for a long time now, to the point where the totality of the civilian population is so adversely at risk and prejudiced, and indeed so many have died, that it makes it very difficult to have an equivalence. Although under international law there isn't the question of proportion, there is nonetheless, I think, a sense of balance of equity, and that whilst Israel's aims, whatever our particular personal opinions is neither here nor there, but whatever their aims are in order to eliminate terrorists, which is permitted under international law, it is not permitted to either target or to involve such civilian vulnerabilities and casualties.
Does it look to you like food is being used as a weapon?
Well, I think that the proposal to want to set up an alternative distribution and supply mechanism to the one that is run by the United Nations, which has got all the capacity and experience, and indeed is absolutely dedicated to compliance with international humanitarian law, as I say, independence, unimpeded, and absolutely to the point of most need. And I think that having the alternative mechanism, where one of the combatants in association with, of course, America, which is both supportive of Israel's position generally, means that there would be a question about capacity, B, sufficiency of supply, and secondly, whether it would be distributed in a way which was according to those absolutely fundamental international legal principles, i.e. to where the need is. I suspect that the alternative mechanism proposed is not planning to be distributing these food and other items in the north of Gaza, and that in itself would not be appropriate. It's difficult enough for the UN to even reach that, but nonetheless, they have a right to demand that, whereas the alternative mechanism, I worry, would not be in compliance with that.
What can the UN do to ensure the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers working there in Gaza?
Well, I think it is doing what it can. The UN, at the end of the day, is the world's highest diplomatic body. As we know, its relationship with one of its member states, namely Israel, has always been difficult and fraught ever since the 1967 war, where many resolutions have been passed which have called into question or indeed ruled as illegal the definition of what Israel regards as its borders. So that has set, if you like, the Israel politics on edge with the UN, and that has always been a problem. But that said, the UN has got, of course, it's got capacity, it's got an international legal right, but diplomacy is only, in the end, as good as you have the license, the possibility of access and safety for your people. You can't be sending your own UN people in who, sadly, we've seen many of them who have succumbed to either the death or the injury that has been, of course, a feature of Gaza over the nearly 2 years. And it's absolutely a problem, because you do have a responsibility if you're the UN leader, in this case the office I used to lead, of not sending people in who are at risk themselves of almost certainly being killed. So, you do have a right to demand access, safe access, and then unimpeded at the quantities of the materials that you think are absolutely necessary to meet the humanitarian need in order to save lives and to protect civilians, particularly those who are most vulnerable. So I think it's I think the current position is untenable, and it is atrocious, and one which all sides need to recognise. I mean, obviously, one of the quickest things that would make sure that we bring this to an end is for the remaining hostages to be released, and that continues to be a demand. And for as long as Hamas has hostages, then there is going to be a plausible, not everybody's going to agree, far from it, but a plausible case for Israel to make that they are still going after the terrorists who've got their hostages.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, obviously some aid has got through, more than 100 trucks got through on Sunday, clearly not enough. But what would you say are the priorities? What would you like to see happen? What would you like to see the international community do to alleviate the suffering of the people of Gaza?
Well, primarily, I think it is clearly going to be important that the Americans, who are to some degree dictating terms here, because to the extent that Israel falls foul of American presidential and political opinion, then it's, if you like, its wings will be clipped. And the international community, I think, has to do everything it possibly can to make sure that the funding for the supplies of what is necessary to the capacity needed in Gaza today is ready on the border with loaded trucks, with goods which are thoroughly checked and don't have to be delayed at the border for somebody else to have another check, but it ought to be fully certified by independent assessors, and that the borders are then opened, and that between 600 and 900 full trucks with all the relevant materials are let in, and are let in to be distributed in safe hubs so you don't get the looting. And of course, you need to have the protection of those who are distributing so you don't have diversion of those goods by those who must not be in receipt of them, because it then undermines the whole operation, which is why it is important that Hamas do not interfere and get in the way or try to supply their own fighters or themselves, or indeed to take hold of the materials in order to on-sell them at a marked up price, which then funds their nefarious activities of battle and terrorism. So, there is a real need to have a readiness to have all that in place, so that the minute it's possible, there is no delay. The gates open and those lorries just trundle across. And the international community has got an enormous responsibility, particularly Egypt, there on the southern border, coming from the Sinai region, but also everybody else for funding it. And as we know, international funding of these international mechanisms, the UN in particular, has been under severe pressure because of the cuts in aid budgets, the collapse of US aid, and the cuts around Europe and elsewhere into the international aid budget, which is so underfunded, it makes you worry that there would be enough even if you did have capacity and the gates were open.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. So Stephen O'Brien, thanks again. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to the former Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, Dan Meridor, who joins us now from Israel. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Great to have you with us here on Arabiya English once again. I just want to ask you about what's been happening in Gaza these last 48 hours. And just to remind our viewers that military operations were stepped up by Israel in early May. What's your understanding of what the Israeli objectives currently are?
Well, the objectives are to give a blow, even further blow to Hamas and to release the hostages. But I can't speak for the government. I am now a free person. My view is that the war should stop immediately. It takes too long, too much suffering. And I think the best thing is to release all prisoners, all kidnapped people, and stop the war as soon as possible. But maybe what we hear now in the press about the Witkoff proposal, maybe we are close to that. In my view, it should be stopped. It's too long and too heavy and too tragic.
Yeah, some are dismissing that report as inaccurate for the time being. So we'll move back to what we do know. And I'd just like to ask you, I know you don't represent the government, but what do you think? I mean, does it feel to you, does it look to you like we are any closer to any kind of a resolution there in Gaza?
Well, if there's reason, and if people think rationally, we should come to the end. I don't see much more that can be gained by either side, and I hope that both sides will be able to put an end to it. The whole thing began with this horrific attack on us on October 7th, and then the counterattack by Israel was legitimate, but the suffering on both sides is too big, too high, too heavy. Many people who are not should not be hurt. In wars, it happens, I know, but this is why I think we should call it off and say, okay, that's it, and let's start building relationship of respect and peace rather than war and terror.
I mean, one of the most recent comments we've heard from your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is that the goal is to have complete control of Gaza. What do you read into that? What does he mean by complete control of Gaza, do you think?
I can't say. I don't think it's our interest to control Gaza in the end. If it's in the process to tell Hamas, you have no option but to surrender and give the hostages and stop the war, then okay. But if the intention is to stay in Gaza, I don't see any reason for it. And we've left Gaza. It's strange, people don't remember it. 2005, 20 years ago, Israel unilaterally left Gaza, all of it, kicked out all the Jews. No Jew was left there, no army, and the first time in history, Palestinians had a land to control. And in no time, the Hamas people rose and killed the PLO people and took control of Gaza and made it a launching pad of rockets and terror. Now, we want it to be, the Gaza to be good neighbors to us. We don't need them to fight us. We want to fight them. And this means that Hamas, that is bent on our destruction, needs to give up and give the hostages. And I hope there will be a very normal government in Gaza by the PA, Palestinian Authority, or with help from Arab states, and to put an end to this very sad chapter.
But as an Israeli citizen, I'm just wondering whether you feel that longer term, the fact that 53,000 or more people have been killed in Gaza during these last 20 months, and just in the last 24 hours, 52 people killed in Gaza City, many of them children. I mean, doesn't it worry you that the amount of pent-up hatred and distress that has been caused is going to make any kind of normal functioning relationship between Israel and a future Palestinian state, I mean, nigh on impossible? The longer this goes on, the more impossible it becomes, surely.
Which is why I think we need to put an end to it as quickly as possible. As I said earlier, no war is tragedy. And even in urban areas, which is much more difficult when terrorists act from within urban areas, very densely populated, unintentional consequences are that people, innocent people, are killed. And this is horrible. This is tragic. And I know there's no mathematical solution in terms of exact points, but I think we had enough and we need to put an end to it and try to rebuild the relationship in a more peaceful way. Had it not been for Hamas attack on us, it would have continued. We had a relationship with them, and you may know that Netanyahu was the one to ask Qatar to give Hamas finance all the time. He thought that they would respond in quiet border, which seemed to be the case until one morning, we, to our tragic stress, we saw that they chose to go to war in a very surprising way. And it really changed everything, and it has a heavy cost on both sides. And you are right, 50,000 people or something like that were killed, many of them civilians, is bad. And I don't want it to continue happening. In wars, these things happen. We should end the war.
The Israeli military is saying that in the latest airstrikes, it's been targeting weapons storage facilities. And I'm just wondering, where's the weaponry coming from? I mean, how is Hamas able to get its hands on fresh supplies of weaponry?
I can make a guess. I'm not in the intelligence now. I don't know. I think the Hamas had a lot of weapons there that they got from Iran, from other unholy allies that they had, and they stored much of it in the tunnels. Many things might have stayed there, not untouched yet. I don't think that they have any import of it now, but I don't know. I just make a guess. I have no idea.
Well, leaders have been gathering in Spain. There's been considerable condemnation for what's been happening in Gaza, not just the last 20 months, but just really as well the last 24 hours. Words like inhumane and senseless being used. We're also just hearing Sweden's foreign ministry just summoned the Israeli ambassador to Stockholm to discuss the situation. I mean, do you think all of this risks damaging Israel's international standing and its relationships with long-standing allies?
Well, yes, there is damage, and I think it should be contained, and we should return to normalcy, if there is normalcy here. I know in times of war, these things happen. I tend to believe, because I know the idea after they take consideration before they make a choice to attack a point, that they are hopefully that they are sure that it's an important target and there are no civilian casualties in big numbers. It happens that in the end, if you count, the numbers are big, and then the tragedies are there, and we see them on TV. And this is bad for the people who were killed, first of all, bad for Israel, for the Palestinians, for everybody. And we need to put an end to it.
But does it worry you as a former deputy prime minister that, there's condemnation coming from far and wide? And on a recent trip to the region, President Trump didn't even stop off in Israel at all.
Well, I don't know about that. Why I can't decipher President Trump's attitude or declarations. He was the one to call for the transfer of 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza. I would never have called for this. I think we have a good relationship with Jordan and Egypt. We need to keep them and not flood them with people from Gaza. So I can't really tell you what President Trump wants, but I speak of Israel. I think we had a war, very justified war, but the cost was very high in civilian casualties, and we need to put an end to it.
The ceasefire, of course, was in place until March, and then it collapsed. What's your understanding of why we didn't enter the next phase of the ceasefire?
Well, in fact, they are not in the room of negotiation. They had negotiated, and the negotiation didn't get them to any agreement. I hope that they will get to it soon enough. Whatever the details are, you see the outcome, and the outcome is not good. Not for any side, and of course not for people who are killed, and not for the hostages who are kept there now 600 days tomorrow in tunnels, and some of them are dead, and 20, maybe more, are alive. And they are there, and we need to bring them home, and we need to stop the war.
Yeah, it's reported that 23 out of the 57 hostages remaining in Gaza are still alive. I mean, is there any news of those hostages?
No, not that I know. I know that at least 20 are certainly alive, they say, and maybe 3 more, it's unclear. And they all have families at home. Some of them were kidnapped from the bedrooms. Some of them were caught in battle. I don't know the numbers now, who's who. But 600 days is much too long. And if the Hamas agrees to release all of them, I think we should put an end to the hostilities now and start to rebuild a peaceful relationship. Not with Hamas, definitely. We had a peaceful relationship with them. We thought we were mistaken. We even allowed, money coming in and other things for them to be able to run their lives there. But they decided to use this money to build tunnels and to attack us. So what are we to do now? I don't know. I hope the Palestinians, maybe with the Palestinian Authority, with maybe the Emirates, maybe Egyptian, will find a way to rebuild Gaza and reconstruct everything that was destroyed in war there for the benefit of the civilian population there. And we'll try to rebuild from scratch relationships that are peaceful for both sides.
The families of the hostages are a loud and powerful voice within Israel. So clearly, Prime Minister Netanyahu getting considerable pressure from them, considerable pressure from the international community to stop what he's doing in Gaza. I mean, he cuts quite an isolated figure, certainly internationally. Does he cut an isolated figure domestically as well, do you think?
Well, the Israeli system, like the British system, is a parliamentary government. As long as there's a majority in parliament, he can rule, and he has a majority, quite consolidated, 68 of 120. As long as he holds this, he will stay in power. If there will be some cracks in coalition, which I don't see now, things may change. If there is a change in the American position, maybe, but so far, yes, the Israeli public is at least divided. The majority speaks for ending the war now, but in the end, the government makes the decision, supported by the parliament, and I hope it will come to an end soon because of everything you said.
Yeah, indeed. 20 months on, and Hamas still isn't defeated. And I just wonder why you think it's taken so long, why Hamas cannot be defeated.
Well, you see, Hamas as a fighting unit is not really there anymore. They have some people, I don't know the numbers, but the vast majority of them I think were hit or they were destroyed in the facilities. I don't think that's the problem. But Hamas, is part of the Muslim Brotherhood idea, and they are spread in many parts. They were established, the Muslim Brotherhood, 100 years ago in Egypt. They were never permitted formally in any Arab country. All the regimes are trying to cope with them. And to get rid of an idea is more difficult than to get rid of arms holder. I hope that the other alternative, which is the Palestinian Authority, made of PLO people mainly, who lost the election to Hamas, I have to admit, and who are somewhat weaker now, will be re-strengthened and will be able to take charge and to represent the Palestinian people in Gaza as they do in the West Bank. There they cooperate with us, and the same people in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, are living there under the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority cooperates with us against Hamas there. If they can take control of Gaza, I would give it to them.
Okay, and just lastly,
for government position, I can't tell you what the government will do.
Okay, just lastly, today is obviously Jerusalem Day, and it's the second such Jerusalem Day since the 7th of October. What would you say the overall mood in Israel is right now? How would you describe it?
Well, the mood is the pressure and stress. People don't yet see the end of it. There is the internal debate of the judicial overhaul that the government tries to get for, and it's not in walk in the park, you see, and there are demonstrations. But in the end, in the democracy, the parliament decides, and so far we haven't resolved the problem. So there is political tension. Elections are to be held not later than, I think, October next year, a year and some months from now. If the government has the power to stay with a majority until then, they will rule. If every election they may be replaced or not. This is where we are. The public is very involved in all sorts of ways, in signing papers and demonstrations and speaking and debating. You can see Israeli TV debates every day and out on everything. People are very involved, and it touches their heart and their mind. People are concerned.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Former Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, Dan Meridor. Thanks again. That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.